The Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE exposed the illusion that Rome's legions were invincible beyond their borders. Eager for personal glory and territorial expansion, Marcus Licinius Crassus marched eastward into Parthian territory with little understanding of the terrain or the tactics he would face. Armed with overconfidence and the weight of Roman arrogance, Crassus refused experienced advice and led his army into the vast, dry plains of Mesopotamia. There, the Parthians revealed a different style of war, fluid, mobile, and relentlessly harassing. Their horse archers rained arrows from a distance, never allowing Rome's heavy infantry to close the distance. The famed testudo formations crumbled under constant assault and the blazing sun. Roman morale collapsed and communication broke down. When Crassus attempted to negotiate, he was taken and the remnants of his force surrendered or scattered. Rome lost not only tens of thousands of soldiers that day, but also its image as a force that could not be outmaneuvered. The disaster became a cautionary tale for every Roman general who followed. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, just over 60 years later in 9 CE, became a symbol of betrayal, misjudgment, and strategic failure. Rome's ambitions to consolidate Germania were spearheaded by Publius Quinctilius Varus, who trusted a Germanic noble named Arminius, an ally raised within the Roman system. But Arminius had other plans. With Rome unaware, he united scattered tribes and lured Varus's 3 legions into a narrow, forested trap. The terrain was a nightmare for Roman tactics. Dense woods, muddy paths, and pouring rain stripped away the order and discipline that Rome relied on. As the soldiers marched single file, ambushes erupted from both sides. For days, chaos reigned. Supply lines were severed, horses bolted, and legionnaires fell in waves. Varus, overwhelmed and encircled, chose not to return home in disgrace. The annihilation was so complete that Rome retrieved only fragments of equipment and scattered bones years later. Emperor Augustus, devastated, reportedly cried out in despair, unable to accept the scale of the loss. Rome would draw its borders tighter and never again attempt to fully conquer Germania.
The Battle of the Kalka River in 1223 demonstrated how ignorance and arrogance could destroy even the most unified coalition. When the Mongols first appeared on the fringes of Eastern Europe, their speed and tactics were unfamiliar to the princes of Kievan Rus. Believing they could overwhelm this unknown enemy through sheer numbers and force, a group of Russian and Cuman leaders assembled a large force to intercept what they assumed was a minor raiding party. In reality, the Mongols had baited them deliberately. After days of pursuit, the coalition army fell into a trap near the Kalka River. The Mongols faked a retreat, pulling the Slavic forces into an overextended chase. When the time was right, they turned and struck with precision. The Allied forces were divided and disorganized, and the Mongol cavalry exploited every weakness. What followed was not just a defeat, it was a rout. Nobles were captured and executed, some reportedly smothered under wooden boards in a slow, agonizing punishment. The Mongols then vanished into the steppe as suddenly as they had arrived, leaving the shattered Rus in disbelief that such a brief engagement could result in such lasting humiliation. The Battle of Ankara in 1402 delivered a crippling blow to the rising Ottoman Empire, not at the hands of a European coalition, but from a rival in the east, Tamerlane. Sultan Bayezid I had been expanding his empire rapidly and seemed poised to challenge European powers directly. But his growing reputation attracted the attention of Timur, the Central Asian warlord building a legacy of conquest equal to Genghis Khan's. When the two forces met near Ankara, Bayezid commanded a large, diverse army, including Serbian vassals and elite janissaries. But Timur, experienced in breaking empires from within, had already sown distrust among Bayezid's ranks. On the battlefield, the factions and poor coordination undermined the Ottoman position. The heat, lack of water, and confusion shattered discipline. Timur's cavalry flanked and isolated key units, and Bayezid's forces collapsed. The Sultan was captured, taken alive, placed in a gilded cage, and paraded as a trophy. The result wasn't just a loss on the battlefield, it plunged the Ottomans into a civil war that lasted over a decade, delaying their rise and marking one of the few times they were brought to their knees by a rival power.
The Battle of Hastings in 1066 is often remembered for founding a new English dynasty, but it also stands as a cautionary tale about overextension and exhaustion leading to disaster. Harold Godwinson, newly crowned King of England, faced 2 invasions within weeks, first from the Norwegian king Harold Hardrada in the north, and then from William of Normandy in the south. After marching his army 190 miles in 4 days to defeat the Norwegians at Stamford Bridge, a remarkable feat, Harold barely allowed his men to rest before turning back south to face William. The speed of his return was impressive, but left his forces depleted and disorganized. At Hastings, the Anglo-Saxons formed a solid shield wall atop a ridge, initially holding their ground. But William's feigned retreats and persistent cavalry charges eventually lured parts of Harold's line into breaking formation. In a chaotic push, Harold was struck down, possibly by an arrow to the eye, and his army collapsed. England was lost in a single day, not due to cowardice or lack of numbers, but because of the grinding toll of constant warfare and a misjudged final stand. It was a strategic blunder that handed the crown to a foreign invader. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415, though often told from the perspective of English triumph, was in reality a humiliating disaster for the French nobility. Outnumbering the English nearly 3-1, France believed the battle would be little more than a cleanup operation to crush Henry V's small, sick, and retreating army. French knights, confident in their strength and armor, prepared to charge across a muddy field narrowed by woods on both flanks, a natural bottleneck. Rain the night before had turned the ground into a thick soup, and the heavily armored French cavalry and infantry sank into it with every step. English longbowmen, stationed behind sharpened stakes, unleashed wave after wave of arrows that disrupted formations and panicked horses. French knights fell into heaps, unable to move or breathe beneath their own weight. Those who reached the English lines were too tired to fight effectively. Thousands were captured or neutralized. The pride of French chivalry lay broken in the mud, and many of the nobles who had mocked Henry V's campaign days earlier found themselves disgraced or taken prisoner. The loss wasn't just military, it was psychological, exposing the cracks in a feudal system built on assumed superiority and outdated tactics.
The Battle of Fort Ticonderoga in 1777 is one of the most quietly humiliating episodes in American military history, not because of a devastating loss in combat, but because there was no combat at all. Just 2 years earlier, the American forces under Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold had triumphantly seized the fort from the British in a daring surprise attack, gaining cannons that would later help break the siege of Boston. It was a symbolic early victory in the Revolutionary War. But by 1777, the situation had reversed. British General John Burgoyne launched an ambitious campaign to split the American colonies by advancing south from Canada. Fort Ticonderoga stood in his path, perched on high ground and defended by a sizable American garrison. The Americans believed the fort was nearly impregnable from direct assault, until the British occupied nearby Mount Defiance, a higher elevation with a clear line of fire into the fort. The American commander, General Arthur St. Clair, realized the position was hopeless. Rather than suffer a massacre, he ordered a retreat under cover of darkness. When the British arrived, they found the fort abandoned. The loss was strategically small, but symbolically massive. The fort that had once represented American daring now represented poor planning and failure to defend critical terrain. It sparked outrage among American patriots and became a textbook example of how complacency and terrain misjudgment could lead to embarrassment. The Battle of Karánsebes in 1788 defies belief, not just for its absurdity, but for the sheer scale of miscommunication that turned an entire army against itself. During the Austro-Turkish War, the Austrian army, made up of conscripted soldiers speaking different languages, had set up camp near the town of Karánsebes in present-day Romania. Fearing an Ottoman attack, the troops were on edge. One night, a group of scouts crossed a river to investigate, but instead found alcohol being sold by local traders. They began drinking, and when other soldiers came looking for them, a drunken argument escalated into gunfire. Panic spread. Mistaking the commotion for an Ottoman attack, various regiments began firing into the darkness at anything that moved, including each other. Officers tried to regain control by shouting orders, but language barriers made things worse. Shouts of "the Turks are here" rippled through the camp, sending entire battalions into retreat. Artillery crews opened fire blindly, and cavalry units charged in the wrong direction. By dawn, hundreds were wounded or worse, and no enemy had even appeared. When the actual Ottoman forces arrived days later, they encountered little resistance, just chaos and broken morale. The Battle of Karánsebes is rarely discussed in grand histories, but among military scholars, it's a legendary example of how panic, alcohol, and poor coordination can do more damage than the enemy ever could.
The Battle of Isandlwana in 1879 shocked the British Empire to its core and forced it to confront a truth it wasn't prepared to face. A technologically superior army could still be overwhelmed by tactical brilliance and local resolve. At the time, British colonial forces in southern Africa were advancing into Zulu territory under the assumption that a modern industrialized power had little to fear from native resistance. Lord Chelmsford, the British commander, divided his forces, leaving around 1,800 men encamped at Isandlwana without proper fortifications or scouting. He believed the Zulu threat was minimal. But the Zulu army, highly organized and expertly trained in encirclement tactics, had other plans. With remarkable speed and stealth, roughly 20,000 Zulu warriors advanced on the British camp using the classic Horns of the Buffalo formation to envelop their enemy. The British troops fought with discipline and modern rifles, but they were quickly outflanked. Ammunition supply lines broke down, communication failed. Within hours, the camp was overrun, and nearly all British soldiers were overwhelmed. Fewer than 100 escaped. The loss sent shockwaves through London, not just because of the casualties, but because an empire that had grown used to easy colonial victories had just suffered one of its worst defeats at the hands of a supposedly inferior force. Isandlwana became a symbol of British overreach in the price of underestimating indigenous resistance. The charge of the Light Brigade in 1854 remains one of the most iconic military failures in modern memory, not because of cowardice, but because of blind obedience, poor communication, and the fatal gap between command and reality. During the Crimean War, British and Allied forces were engaged with the Russian Empire near Balaclava. Misinterpreting a vague order from high command, the Light Brigade, an elite cavalry unit, was sent charging directly into a valley lined with Russian artillery on both sides and fortified infantry at the end. The men knew the situation made no sense, but they charged anyway, displaying extraordinary bravery in what was essentially a death trap. Cannons fired from above, musket balls rained down from the flanks, and yet the brigade rode forward, sabers drawn, toward inevitable ruin. They reached the Russian lines, but were too few to hold the ground, and those who survived the initial attack were forced into retreat. Of the roughly 600 who charged, nearly half were lost. News of the disaster spread quickly in Britain, inspiring Tennyson's famous poem that immortalized their courage but could not disguise the strategic blunder that caused it. The charge became a paradox, a shining example of valor overshadowed by disastrous leadership. It revealed just how dangerous it was when glory, pride, and miscommunication were allowed to dictate battlefield decisions.
The Battle of Adwa in 1896 delivered one of the most stunning reversals in colonial history as Ethiopia, an African nation often dismissed by European powers, decisively defeated Italy and preserved its sovereignty. Italy had ambitions of building an empire to rival Britain or France, and Ethiopia was seen as a manageable first conquest. Armed with modern weapons and European training, Italian commanders assumed victory would be swift. But Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia had anticipated their aggression. He had stockpiled weapons, unified rival factions, and built a force of over 100,000 troops who were highly motivated to protect their land and culture. When the two forces met near Adwa, Italy's assumptions collapsed immediately. The terrain was poorly understood by the Italians, their maps were inaccurate, and their units became separated and disoriented. Meanwhile, Ethiopian forces struck in coordinated waves, using their knowledge of the landscape and superior numbers to crush each Italian division in turn. By the end of the battle, thousands of Italian troops were lost, and many more were taken prisoner. The result humiliated the Italian government and sent shockwaves through Europe. For Ethiopia, Adwa became a source of national pride and proof that African resistance could triumph against European imperialism. For Italy, it was an international embarrassment, a complete collapse of military planning, and a diplomatic disaster that tarnished its ambitions for decades. The Battle of Tsushima in 1905 was a crushing naval defeat for Russia that shattered its reputation as a great power and handed Japan the respect of the global stage. The Russo-Japanese War had already seen surprising Japanese victories on land, but Russia believed its massive Baltic fleet, slowly making its way around the world, would turn the tide. After a grueling 8-month journey suffering storms, mechanical failures, and even friendly fire incidents, the fleet finally approached the Tsushima Strait between Korea and Japan. What followed was one of the most one-sided naval battles in history. The Japanese fleet, faster, more maneuverable, and better led by Admiral Togo, waited patiently and struck with devastating accuracy. Russian ships, many outdated and poorly maintained, were outmaneuvered and systematically destroyed. Communication on the Russian side was disorganized, morale was low, and many of the crews were inexperienced. In the end, 2/3 of the Russian fleet was lost, either sunk, captured, or scuttled. The Japanese lost only a few torpedo boats. The scale of the defeat stunned Europe. For the first time in modern history, an Asian power had decisively defeated a European empire in open war. Tsushima wasn't just a military failure, it was a humiliation that contributed directly to the unrest leading to the Russian Revolution of 1905. For Japan, it marked the beginning of its emergence as a major global power. The fall of Singapore in 1942 remains one of the most embarrassing defeats in British military history. Not because of overwhelming enemy force, but because of strategic underestimation and rigid thinking. Singapore had long been referred to as the Gibraltar of the East, a fortress deemed impenetrable by sea. But the Japanese didn't come by sea. They marched through the jungles of Malaya, advancing rapidly by bicycle and foot through terrain the British assumed was impassable. Despite being outnumbered, Japanese forces used speed, coordination, and shock tactics to dismantle Allied positions. The British, Australian, and Indian troops stationed in Singapore were better equipped and more numerous, yet leadership failed to anticipate or adapt to the changing tactics of their enemy. British commanders were caught off guard when Japanese troops reached the island's northern shores, having bypassed much of the British naval defenses. On February 15, 1942, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered over 80,000 Allied troops to a force of fewer than 40,000 Japanese soldiers. The image of British officers marching out with white flags crushed the aura of imperial invincibility. Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The fall of Singapore marked a turning point not only in the Pacific War, but also in global attitudes toward colonial power. It became clear that the age of European dominance in Asia was nearing its end. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 delivered a different kind of humiliation, one that played out in front of television cameras and stained the reputation of an American president in the Cold War spotlight. The plan, developed under the Eisenhower administration and approved by newly elected President John F. Kennedy, involved training and arming a group of Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro. The idea was to spark a popular uprising that would topple the revolutionary government without direct American involvement. But nearly every assumption turned out to be flawed. The invaders landed at the Bay of Pigs, isolated and without air support, after Kennedy canceled key bombing runs to preserve plausible deniability. Castro's forces were ready. Instead of joining the revolt, the Cuban population rallied behind their government, and within 3 days, the invasion collapsed. More than 1,000 exiles were captured, and the CIA's covert role became an international embarrassment. For Kennedy, the operation was a political disaster that painted the U.S. as both aggressive and inept. It strengthened Castro's position, pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union, and helped set the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis the following year.
The Bay of Pigs remains a case study in flawed intelligence, bureaucratic overconfidence, and the limits of covert intervention.
Operation Eagle Claw in 1980 closed out the decade and this list with a high-profile failure that exposed the fragility of military planning under extreme political pressure. Following the Iranian Revolution and the takeover of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, 52 American diplomats and citizens were taken hostage, sparking a prolonged and painful international standoff. After months of failed negotiations, the U.S. government approved a daring rescue plan involving elite commandos, multiple aircraft, and a rendezvous deep in the Iranian desert. It was bold, complex, and, in retrospect, far too ambitious for the conditions and equipment at hand. Mechanical problems began almost immediately. Helicopters malfunctioned en route, forcing mission commanders to cancel the operation mid-execution. As the team prepared to withdraw from a remote desert site known as Desert 1, a helicopter collided with a transport plane during refueling, resulting in a fiery explosion that left 8 American personnel gone and several others injured. The hostages remained in captivity, and news of the mission's failure spread quickly across the globe. Domestically, it devastated public confidence in President Jimmy Carter and became a key issue in his re-election defeat. Internationally, it portrayed the U.S. as clumsy and overreaching. For the military, the event led to deep introspection and ultimately the creation of more specialized and integrated special operations forces. But in the moment, it was pure embarrassment, a rescue mission that never reached its target and played out, quite literally, in smoke and flame.